Hello, everyone. Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. I think, first of all, thanks to the organizers of this forum for inviting me again to give a speech. And whenever I come to Tucumán, I always like to remember one of our great proponents of freedom, who is Alberti, who is a scholar of our Constitution. He is one of our great thinkers, not only for Argentina, but worldwide, recognized worldwide, regarding his work, and obviously the scholar of the Constitution. And in that sense, what at the same time is conjugated with the fact that recently 250 years have passed since the publication of that wonderful work by Adam Smith, which gave rise to the birth of economics as a science, and that book entitled Research on the Nature and the Causes and Worth of Nations, which in the end are the foundations of what Alberti is thinking about, the economic and rent system of Argentina. So, and in light of that, in addition, we as liberals carry a government program strongly inspired by these ideas. Basically, what I intend today is basically to describe the essential contributions of Adam Smith in the wealth of the nations, that of direct consequences on the way in which we design our public policies or state policies. We have recently been developing and presenting an idea, which is this notion of morality as a state policy. And the reality is that when one reviews all the work of Adam Smith, we realize that this was actually already invented. Nothing more than we only saw it in another way and in another format. But basically it is not made explicit. But it is implicit in the way in which Adam Smith addresses the issues. Basically, he was a great professor of moral philosophy. His course on moral philosophy had 4 parts. It had a part that was basically theology. I mean, in general, Adam Smith did not usually refer to theology, because at that time some misinterpretations that could be made were quite complicated in terms of results, to such an extent that it could cost them their lives. Therefore, he did not try to. And also his friend David Hume, due to having opinions contrary to the thought of the time, he was marginalized from several classes and so on. So Adam Smith tried to be quite prudent on this subject. That does not mean that he did not have a position, but that is part of another story. And the second issue, the second part of his course was the part of ethics. And precisely with that, it is linked to his second, his work, one of his best known works, which is with which he actually became famous, which is the theory of moral feelings, where he basically develops the concept of empathy. But if one reaches the final part of the book, which is where it deals with the subject of cardinal virtues, and there he shows his alignment with the Stoics. Then he had the part of political economy, which basically we have the research on nature and the cause of the wealth of the nations, which precisely comes to cover that part of a course. And the last part had to do with jurisprudence. Adam Smith had generated material about it. He had a project to make a book about jurisprudence. Jurisprudence in Adam Smith is not in the sense that we understand it today, as that right that is being created from the sanctions of the judges. But one has to understand it in the logic of his course of moral philosophy, which has to do with the moral question. That is, basically with what is fair, that discussion on that side. And in that sense, it is always good to be clear that something can be legal, but not necessarily immoral. When you generate rules that go against natural law, that becomes essentially illegitimate. And the natural result is that it leads to bigger problems than those that it tries to correct. I say that not only is it valid for the rate, it is valid for almost any order of life. And that part of Adam Smith's work, he asked that when he died they burn them. And indeed they bind them. But what could be rescued were the notes. And with that, his thought in the matter could be partially reproduced. A different kind of luck took his other essays, where, for example, is the history of astronomy, which also asked that they be bent, that they did not pay attention to it, and they are published. And the other work that is known by Adam Smith are all the epistolary exchanges, where without a doubt the richest part is all the interaction with David Hume, who also, I have the feeling that he was someone extremely sympathetic and deeply liberal, because it is Hume himself who takes him to England to Rousseau, someone with whom he clearly thought differently. Rousseau first takes it well, and then the beating he receives gets angry with Hume. And I doubt that Hume took him to make him Girgonga. He took him for the debate. I have that feeling, and it was also very ironic. They were very funny guys when you read them in the epistolary exchanges. Basically, what I want to comment today about Adam Smith are 3 blocks. That, for me, from my point of view, are important to understand Adam Smith, to understand the interaction with our national constitution, and why it is decisive for our government. I have no pretension to be a generalist or to be in certainty and in truth. About what my opinion of Adam Smith is and how it has a direct impact on the way in which we make decisions. Basically, the contributions of Adam Smith in the wealth of the nations. I put it in the logic of 3 blocks. The first block, where I put Adam Smith the mice, is the fact that he is someone who wrote 200 years ahead of his time. I used to use a phrase about Adam Smith, which is that Adam Smith is the economy that causes mathematics. He is someone who went 200 years ahead. Nothing more than he had a different character. I mean, Adam Smith, as he had a very strong teaching vocation. He was very friendly and so on. In the case of Gauss, he was quite harsh, Carlos Federico. He only had one disciple because he didn't have the patience for people to think so slowly about him. And that disciple was Riemann. I mean, a disciple with someone else. Now, the interesting thing is that I thought that I had a great definition about Adam Smith. And the reality is that by reviewing material, biographies and so on about Adam Smith, I discovered that I wasn't quite original in that. I mean, his best student, John Milei, had already done that. And he said that Adam Smith was the Newton of moral philosophy. I think that's an even better definition than mine. Now, why is it important to discuss Adam Smith? Because clearly he went 200 years ahead. He is basically the one who saw first what in the theory of economic growth is called the hockey stick. The hockey stick is a graph that basically we owe to an economist who is called Madison in Peace of Mind, where basically what Madison does, the field is called millennial macroeconomics, and God is a field that he basically invented, and he is in charge of looking at the GDP throughout history. The first part was done between the year 1000 and 2000, that is, from the Christian era, then he did it until the year 0. And the reality is that if one looks at the conditions of man essentially, they didn't change until the Industrial Revolution arrived. I mean, this doesn't mean that I think of the hockey stick in times of the moment when the Industrial Revolution appears. That is factual, but there is something that is generated before. I mean, I say this because the version that I like the most of the explanation of the hockey stick, which is a GDP that is stagnant with a slight improvement of 40%. I say after the discovery of America, that's afraid in the time that that series is looked at. It implied an improvement of the GDP per capita in terms of growth of 0.2%. That is, we needed 3,500 years to double the GDP. And in that sense, when we get to the moment of the Industrial Revolution after that, the GDP per capita multiplied by 15 times, and also the population multiplied by 10. It means that we have lived a situation of generation of wealth never seen in the history of humanity. Now, that situation, from my point of view, is that the processes of growth have a logic of exponential functions. And that is that it starts very slow, and when it finds a turning point, it accelerates. I see the Industrial Revolution as that turning point. However, when you see those two periods, they have what is called the Malthusian period, which is the stagnation period, and then they have the growth period, which nobody calls the Adam Smith period, and I would say that Adam Smith did see it, and that in economics. First they tried to analyze with the models of growth, how from the 50s. The model of Solar is the emblematic, and the problem with that model is that it did not really explain growth. I mean, it explained the transition to a GDP per capita of equilibrium, but in the stationary state of that model, it does not generate growth. In other words, it generates convergence. But the reality is that in the long term, it does not generate growth. And all that discussion of literature made that by the mid-70s, that literature was practically permitted, on the way to extinction, until an economist named Paul Romer appeared, who in the year 1983, being a mathematician, student of Robert Lucas Jr., developed a theory of endogenous growth, and in the year 1985, Robert Lucas Jr. himself popularized it in what is the Lena Robbins readings. And from there, the economists began to discover the theory of endogenous growth, which is what allows us to explain the part of the hockey stick that rises. In that context, you have a theory that explains pre-industrial revolution, which is a Malthusian theory, and then you have another, which are the models of endogenous growth. The truth is that they are the models of the medium, served to reach the endogenous ones, nothing more. In other words, it was a learning process, so to speak, in some way. But apart from that, it serves to explain convergence. That is something quite interesting and positive, for the light of the problems we face. But there was no unification. There is a theory, which is the unified growth theory. It is from an author called Oded Gayler. And basically, he manages to link the two models, the Malthusian dynamics and the exponential growth dynamics, and that focuses on human capital. The main invention here happens to be the footprint. And from the footprint of Gutenberg, knowledge is beginning to be disseminated, each time on a larger scale, and it allows an interaction that has appeared. The liberal thought and the respect to property rights in the center. We see that from Locke. Then it arrives and disengages in the Industrial Revolution, and from there we experience what Gayler does. Precisely in linking those two parts, beyond how it is resolved, to the preferences of each one. The important thing is that Adam Smith saw it, and the truth is that, standing in the moment that Adam Smith wrote, there was not so much evidence to see why he had seen it. And that is why it is very important to me. And that is why the name Father of the Economy is more than one. Because in the end, sorry for the term, but why the hell do we do economy if it is not for people to be better? When you go and read an economic growth book, except that it is a very, very, very old book. All economic growth books have a phrase by Robert Lucas Jr. that says that when one begins to think about these problems, he cannot think of anything else. That phrase derives from a speech that Robert Lucas Jr. is giving that says, compare two countries, if one is good and the other is bad. And then he says, well, what is it that explains these differences? And of course, when one begins to think about that, Clearly, he cannot think of anything else. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, not only did he live in 800 million human beings on the planet and they lived terrible lives, more than 95% of the population lived below the extreme poverty line. Today, that number, in a population 10 times bigger, is less than 5. In fact, the extreme poverty line is being changed all the time, so that the number does not disappear, so to speak, in a way. So in that sense, it is not trivial. Because we are talking about improving the quality of life of people. And that was what he was trying to study in The Wealth of Nations. Because it is precisely that research on nature and the cause of the wealth of nations. And there, the central core that explained economic growth. And that explains many of the issues that we discussed today. If I tell you something in light of how we live today, and I would like to explain, well, we need to understand what is going to generate growth from now on. Without a doubt, a fundamental role. Who's going to have it? The artificial intelligence. Well, the interesting thing about Adam Smith is that artificial intelligence is the 21st century brick factory. That is, and all those fears and all those dystopian scenarios. I say that in fact I discussed them in the G7, not because Argentina was part of the G7, but because Milei invited me to talk about that. It is, let's discard the dystopian scenarios. They make no sense. They are built on bad economic theory. And I have in my favor 250 years of empirical evidence. So, and that idea, which is the idea of the pin factory, which has to do with the division of labor, basically the technical name in economics, is called growing performance. Adam Smith, who was also a fan of Newton, because he was an intense fan of Newton, more or less, gave all the Scottish illustrations of Newton's fan. They were guys who, first the data, that is, they were guys who, the only thing that wound them up was to look at numbers and real tangible things. So one of the things Adam Smith knows is a pin factory. So if a person is dedicated to making the pin alone, if he were an expert, he could do 20 per day. What he says and observes is that if he starts the activity at 18, and you have 10 people doing it, one of the things that results is that the production jumps to 48,000. That is 4,800 per person. That is, there is a phenomenal increase in productivity. That is, the division of labor generates an increase in productivity. That makes you, when increasing the number of jobs, the production increases more than proportionally. That in economics is called growing yield. That is, when you incorporate a factor, the production grows more than proportionally. In general, when you go to a micro book or an economic growth book, and so on, and the function of production is described, it is not described that way. It is described as Malthusian. That is, the production grows but less than proportionally. In fact, the first to try to refute Adam Smith was Malthus. I mean, and less of the facts. If you had hired an economist in 1801, Malthus would have been right. But it is the virtue of Adam Smith, he saw it. He saw the hockey stick when the hockey stick did not exist. So basically, when you look at the hockey stick, it is Adam Smith. I mean, why? Because the population multiplied by 10, but the production did it by 150. That is, it increased 15 times more. And Adam Smith not only raises this question of growing yield, but also says, but this is a limit. That is, this is not that it can go anywhere. This is not that it goes to infinity. I mean, they're in a growth spurt that is marked by economists. It says only two types of people can believe. that trees can reach the sky. Fools and economists. So he says, no, but this is not that trees can reach the sky. No, this is a limit. The limit, this Adam Smith limits it from two sides. One is the size of the market. That is, and this becomes quite evident. I love the example that Juan Carlos de Pablo uses about it. Suppose you are a doctor. Well, if you are going to live in a very small city, in a town, what is convenient for you? To be a hyper-specialist of a very particular issue, or to be a generalist? The answer is obvious. You have to be a generalist. That is, you do not desire of discussion. On the other hand, if you live in a big city, well, there is room for what? Free to specialize in different fields. Well, that is the division of labor. You go into specialize. That is, this carpenter's factory that does the division of labor. Why does it reach 48,000 carpenters? Because he can sell them. Because if he cannot sell them to anyone, it will be limited. That is the division of labor. Then it will have a limit, which is the size of the market. When they start with all the dystopian scenarios, they say, no, they're going to leave people out. And the question is, what do they do with artificial intelligence? Artificial intelligence for artificial intelligence. Now they make artificial intelligence so that a product has certain characteristics that are of better quality, with a better price, and what do? What do? They sell it to someone. Well, first we have a limit. There are 8,250 million people. That is, there is a limit. That is, it does not go anywhere. And then there is another limit. That's the economic theory. From my point of view, treats it badly. And that is that in order to prevent the trees from reaching the sky, they put restrictions on the models. This was said by Dr. Demian Riedo. We have corrected it in a work. That work I mentioned in Davos as last meeting. And in reality, what we say is, well, it cannot go infinite, because deep down, you have a restriction on resources. And the limiting resource, what is it? There is a limit, it is work. That is, you cannot work more than 24 hours a day. He cannot work more than 24 hours a day. In other words, if he wanted to do it, he could not do it for a long time. That is because sooner or later they will collapse with the physical restriction of their human body. So there is a limit, that is, it is not unlimited either. In the case that we have elaborated with Demian, the result is that there are multiple balances. There are three balances. There is an intermediate balance that is unstable, and there are two stable balances. One is you become a prosperous society, and in another you become a miserable society. And it all depends on how much you get into working. That is, with which we return to Adam Smith, an exhortation of work, which also has to do with its religious position. For some it seems a criticism. For me it seems precisely this consideration, an evaluation of work. Now it seems abstract. There is a film that I love, which is so more gentle and rich as precisely a vignette that deals with this problem. They did not treat it especially because they knew about growth. I mean, a guy saw it, which is the case when Francella is in a restaurant eating and a boy comes to ask for it. Then the waiter of the restaurant tries to get and says, no, no, leave it. and she invites him to eat, and he gives him food, and then he invites him. He takes him to buy a cell phone. He takes him to buy clothes. He takes him to buy shoes. And the interesting part, what is it? That when he is taking him to the house, he says, it's brilliant. He says, you are lucky, he says. You have a lot of time. That is, you can have time. And he says, instead of me, I say, I'm like this. The boy looks at him like he's crazy. I say, you have a lot of time. And the boy's in the... And when he looks at him, the card falls. Friend Charlie says, well, if you give me a choose, my situation or yours, I'll stay with mine. But the important thing is that you could generate those two types of balance. That is, the two are stable. Nothing more than one is a trap of poverty, and the other, you are going to be rich. And then now they're going to start understanding what I am trying to convey. Any intermediate balance is unstable. That is, either they go to the side of wealth, or they go to the side of poverty. But the determining fact that moves them to one side or the other is that they work. And if you, for 100 years, were promoting wandering based on that immunity, social justice, and you were promoting progressivism, the logical thing was that we were going to explode. I already know. In 2023, Argentina; in 2023, it was going to be Cuba, with an intermediate station in Venezuela. That is 100 years of this, of promoting violence, parasitism, of so much leftist idea. I say because essentially the left is an idea of parasites. That is, there are people who have a lot of money, They are people who have an inherent tendency not to work. That is, because if they work, they feel exploited. If they are bosses, they are exploiters. And this, they are unemployed. They are unfortunate. So they deparasitism in the state. The only thing we do in our lives is develop rhetoric so that you feel guilty at their misery and then eat their pockets. And that gave the Argentines two options for change. There was a more radicalized option that represented and represents advanced freedom, and there was a non-radicalized option that we have the honor of having here is us, who competed with me, Dr. Bilrich, and I had the greatness that when people preferred the more radicalized option, instead of opting for a miserable situation, decided to get involved with this radical change that we have promoted, with which we are making the best government in history. But this is thanks to Dr. Bowich, decided to put her personal issues to the side to build a better Argentina. Thank you very much, Dr. Boric. Therefore, this who got out of the trap of poverty and avoided the balance of that intermediate that led us to Cuba, in reality, is a mate to the Argentines because they had the balls, the change. The only thing we do is to interpret that change. Therefore, the pin factory is more present than ever but with different formats. And the other thing that Adam Smith does is, because we also have to understand that in his time, when the model does not explode, he creates the theory of the value of work. And that way the whole model is tied to work. Let's say, with Damien, we were able to make a version according to the theory of the value with which we work today. Now, I say Adam Smith only generated that. No, he didn't just generate that. Adam Smith also described technological progress. Think that The Wealth of the Nations was written between 1766 and 1776. In other words, he described technological progress. He described technological progress in two ways. One was what we today call the learning by doing. He says, well, he took not only when he partitioned the number of activities, when he started to waste less time and changing from one activity to another, that is, there's a saving of time, but also he learned to do it better, and every day you do it better, and every day but her better, he become more productive, because you learn to do your work better with the running of the activity. But at one point, he discovered that there is a weighing of so much that you learn to do it that allows you to take a leap of productivity to save time, because in the end, work is neither more nor less than leisure put at the disposal of the market. So what happens in that context, where you value your time, you make an improvement, and that makes a leap of productivity. That is called technological progress. With the same amount of time, you produce more. That is, with the same amount of income, you produce more, or you can produce the same, but working less, or with less income. That is technological progress. I had seen it. There's one of the things that happened to me reviewing all this material with the conference that we gave yesterday in the Palace of Liberty, is that I discovered that when Adam Smith was the director of Glasgow, he had assigned a workshop in Glasgow to James Watt, that is, the inventor of the steam engine. That is, it means that Adam Smith saw it and put it in a model that said, well, if we go this way, this is going to generate wealth. The guy had already seen it. I mean, he was interacting with a steam engine. I mean, it's like Julio Burnside. Yes, of course. Why? Because it was related with what? With scientists. So, I mean, that also has to be taken into account of the gate that Adam Smith saw. Another thing that is also very important is that Adam Smith, within the virtues that he considers, that is prudence, which is the one that derives his own interest. There are two dimensions of what he calls prudence. The pretense. The first thing I suggest is that when we use the terms of Adam Smith, let's think about when he read, and let's think that Adam Smith was a super erudite guy who knew Latin and knew Greek, and he knew ancient Greek. So he spent a lot of time choosing the weights. So, for example, for Adam Smith, sympathy is something quite similar, and he aligns it with the Greek meaning of compassion, and that in the terminology that we use today, for example, is empathy. Let's say this, then we will use it later in the last part, which is when we later get into politics, into the design of state policies, in the sense when we work on the traditional models of saving. The only thing you do in a model, for example, or solo, is you increase the savings, and what increases is the GDP per capita till the state of station A, but once you get to the station A state, the growth rate does not change. That is to say that you have a leap once and forever. Then you have to converge, and that is an element of second order, but it does not modify the long-term growth rate. It only modifies the dynamic transition. That is, you go from this GDP per capita to a high one. You are going to converge and it is over. On the other hand, in this area of endogenous growth, when you generate a leap in saving, what is generated is a leap in the growth rate. That is to say, the level, then they come to you, a passive growth, and they're going to go to a high one with which the GDP per capita is going to be higher, but is none. That at some point it freezes. No, that becomes permanent. Well, that is no less to the effects of what happened in the history of humanity in the last 215 years. That is what we care about. Look at the types of economic growth. Well, I say we do. When I was a serious economist, I did those things, denying dedication of myself to something else. I got into politics. I ended up, by the will of the Argentines, and the creator being president of the nation, but so it means that there is an important role for saving. Well, this is not trivial, because on the other side we have the cavemen, we have the Mentros, let's say, we have the Keynesians, who what they want to do all the time is defeat the consumer, the consumer, the consumer, the consumer, the consumer, the multiplier, the multiplier, the multiplier. And the reality is that if you reduce savings, savings is future consumption. That is, when you save, savings finances investment, and that is what generates the increase of the product per capita, because it increases the stock of capital per capita, and therefore the product per capita, therefore fostering consumption. In the detriment of savings, what it does is burst economic growth. That is why the wild animals, when they left us 15% of the fiscal deficit in terms of the GDP, 5% in the treasury and 10% in the central bank. Obviously, as Argentina is also a serial defaulter, it also had the agreement that is had with the fund. It financed it as emitting money, and in the year 2023, the beast, that throughout the last period in which they were in the government, which we hope has already been the last in history, for which we work intensely. They finance 28% of the GDP was monetary emissions, but in the last year they emitted 13 points of a GDP. That is why inflation ran at 1.5 daily. It is incredible that those hard faces that left the wholesale inflation at 54% daily, sorry, monthly, which generalized gives 17,000, come and complain if we have one monthly, which is 13 annual. And besides, you cannot say that I just now started talking, because I have been talking for a long time, since the beginning of the wholesale, because it is the one that is anticipated, that is with which, sooner or later, if we continue doing the homework, and let's see, and the correction of relative prices finished, as a result of the bestialities that the previous government made, they know that inexorably inflation will end in Argentina. Therefore, and that was achieved. How did we achieve the savings? We said that we were going to go to deficit zero the first year. And what did they say? That was impossible. That was luck. With a lot of luck and a lot of effort, we could get to the final balance of mandate. Well, fortunately, we ran into a man who they call Tota, and he put the accounts in order in a month. And the disaster of the central bank we fixed in 6 months, and the monetary base since mid-May 2024 did not grow anymore. Therefore, when the money overhead effects, as a result of having control of capital are cleaned, let's say when the remittances of monetary policy are cleaned, and when the disaster caused during the second half of last year, trying to turn a government, when all that happens is to wait for the month of August of this year, the consumer inflation starts with 0. Do you like it or not? Obviously, the economy is a social science. It is not a natural science. It is not physical. Things can happen in the world. A jump in the price of oil can be generated. A jump in the price of gas can be happen. Okay, that can happen. The price level can jump, which manifests itself as a greater inflation, but as long as you continue to maintain fiscal balance and ties in the monetary policy, as we have been doing since mid-May 2024, inexorably, a little earlier, a little later, inflation will end in Argentina. Therefore, we have the issue of increasing returns. We are preparing ourselves for artificial intelligence. We have technological progress. We have the exaltation of savings. We have the exaltation of work. And now comes another part that I love. And that is also part of the discussion as the economic theory. And it is the second block that I want to address about Adam Smith, which is the supposed contradiction in Adam Smith. The green then, actuary of pins, and what is the idea of the invisible hand? The invisible hand, the reality is that some believe that it refers to the creed, to others, to the supply and demand, others to the general balance, others to the Sefer, others to the optimist of Pareto. The reality is that beyond the metaphor that Adam Smith used, which is brilliant because he immortalized his work, I think the vast majority did not read La Requisite de los Nations. They had from Keynes, and they did not read it. So the Wealth of Nations, which is a little older, I did not doubt that someone has put his hand, was a lot of courage, something that he likes, economic though history. Some of us like it. But the important thing is that the idea of the invisible hand, as it was treated by neoclassical economists, the idea of the invisible hand is the spontaneous order. It was not original. The idea of the spontaneous order was something of the time. It was in Manville. It was in him. It was in different authors. The idea of the spontaneous order was floating, and it was part of a debate that they had at the time, especially in Scotland. Scotland that, as a consequence of joining England and opening up to trade, and now the port of Scotland was much cheaper than Bristol. So they began to commercialize the tobacco that came from the United States, from Virginia, from North Carolina, from South Carolina, from New Jersey, from New York, from Massachusetts. And that generated an explosion of wealth in Scotland. The Scottish aristocrats were people who had filled their pockets with trade. They were not like the English. So the guys, with a lot of effort into education, that's where the Scottish illustration takes a lot of relevance. And the interesting thing is that the same thing that happens in a society that starts to prosper, starts to see a group of envious sons of bitches that start to claim for the distribution of income. And this also needs to be said. The reason that most socialists is envy. They have to say it in the face until they feel ashamed of being dead. Because in the end, if I earn the money honestly, serving the next one, it is better quality or better price. I am a hero and I don't have to explain to anyone. And who is the other one to say, what am I going to do with my pocket? There are a couple of phrases from Seoul that are fabulous. He says, what is social justice? And be more rhetorical. And then a moment, God asks himself, since one did a capital sin, like envy, became a virtue, and this is not less, because this is what we are going to discuss on the moral plane, which is the way in which we think politics. But the most interesting thing of all this is that in that context, there was mental. He said that progress has to do with a bad interpretation of how the system works. That is why Smith elaborates theory of moral feelings, and there he begins to develop the idea of the invisible hand and the end of the economic system of the wealth of the nations. But they also had on the other side Rousseau. He said no economic progress brings, let's say, a couple of 730s that it is better to be a savage. And he spoke of the good savage, good not for anything. When they apply socialism, they end up in a primitive society. So, the idea of the invisible hand that the neoclassical theory takes is that, obviously, everyone following their own interest leads to maximum well-being. That is in Smith. But Smith did not saying what they have to do is what the neoclassicals do. He says, okay, my concern is that balance exists. He said that it exists, that it is unique, that it is stable. But now I pretend that it is optimal. Then the functions of which the balance is derived have to be optimal. And this implies that I have to optimize or maximize utility subject to budget restrictions in consumers, and I have to maximize benefits in producers. And here come the functions of demand of goods and supply of factors. In the first case and in the second comes the supply of goods and the demand of factors. And there's functions, if they find a balance. Now it is also optimal. Now the problem of those functions is that when you take to have a maximum benefit, the maximum benefit implies that that function, let's say, so that it is unique, it has to be strictly concave. That is to say that marginal performance has to be decreasing. Then it seems that there is a contradiction in nothing in Smith that has to do with the fact that he works with the growing performance. Therefore, they are not maximizable functions except on the edge. And it is not coherent with the idea of the invisible hand. The problem is not. The problem is how the neoclassicals interpreted it. That is why I make a whole point and other speech about efficiency, and I say the correct vision is that Hans Hermann Hoppe, because he derives optimality from the principle of appropriation and the principle of non-aggression, and it allows he to derive an optimum without having to hold on to a mathematical structure. Therefore, that controversy that Adam Smith has a contradiction is wrong. It is perfectly consistent. And also, if you can solve it with Hoppe, and if you can solve it in mathematical terms, we also gave that solution. We did it with Dr. Riedel. I ask you a question. I say companies. I say that companies are an autonomous entity that do things because he thinks that, for example, as it were, companies as the neoclassical theory is presented, it means that you put a company, a computer, and an entrepreneur to manage it, and it is the same. Well, it is clear that that is a stupidity. I say, and that is a question. Companies, what are they? These abstract ones are not any ones. I say, why do you have a businessman and a company? What is a game? No, let's see. No, it's a fun. I don't know. What do I do? No, I get a lot of money to get income and generate a product, and for nothing. Who is the owner of the companies? The entrepreneurs. And what are the entrepreneurs? What are they? Martians? No, they are human beings who consume things, who have fun, who do something. Therefore, I say, what happens in a company? It has an impact on the life of the entrepreneur, of those who have shares in those companies. Consequently, the split, the twin, the consumer and the entrepreneur is a stupidity. I say it's useful as a mathematical tool. It's called separation theorem. It's nice, but I say, do you ever seriously think about the Robinson Crusoe model? I say, when you see the Robinson Crusoe model, what happens in the textbook? No, first they look at Robinson Crusoe as a consumer. Then they look at Robinson Crusoe as a businessman. And then, as if they had a problem of multiple personality, they interact with each other and determine a balanced price. Come on, Robinson's life was whether or not he went up or down. And then he looked more or less at how much work it cost him and how much coconut he wanted. It's not that, no, Robinson is a consumer, he plans. And also Robinson's budget restriction. Let's say, what was he going to eat on the island if it wasn't coconuts? And to have coconuts, he had to work. I mean, they can't extend that. That's the neoclassical economic theory. And that's wrong. And that's why this ghostly figure appears. The optimal device that is taken by kick with the pin factory. I mean, these guys think there's a conflict between the invisible hand and then in factory. They are, if they are businessmen. In fact, the Austrians say, we're all businessmen. So, in reality, what I just showed you is that there's no such inconsistency. And in reality, this makes us supporters of the free competition, of the free market. In that, Adam Smith also had a position. They pro-competition, let's say, of promoting competition. He had an idea of what was the price of equilibrium, which he called natural price. He had an idea of the market price. He called it. Look at fans. Of Nissan, who spoke, for example, of repose and gravitation, that oppose has to do with finding equilibrium, and gravitation is how they go towards equilibrium. I mean, with which Adam Smith's series about mathematics. But all this must say, one of the parts that Adam Smith does is annihilate the mercantilists, that is, the protectionists, all the foremen. So I'm going to take the license to read something to see how advanced Adam Smith was, and he saw them all. I mean, I'm going to take it from a book, so nobody thinks it is part of my malice. Let's see. He says, by the way, free trade between the countries was too ambitious, even idealistic. With its vital pragmatism, Smith has to wait for free trade to be completely re-established in Great Britain. It's as absurd as waiting for Ethiopia and Ocean to be established. Not only are the prejudices as a public, but also something more difficult to conquer, the private interests, and many people who oppose each other. Now let's see who are the ones who oppose each other. These people were part of the monopolist tribe. After comparing the East Indies was an army that could intimidate the parliament. I mean, the regulators intimidating the representatives of the people. It's a very violent thing, what he describes. He describes how the monopolists applauded and rewarded those who defended their privileges. On the contrary, the untied insolence of the furious and disillusioned monopolists would be laughed. The fall on what they wanted to alter those privileges, even putting their lives in danger. 250 years have passed, and the relationship with us criminals leave is still the same. I mean, is here. Let's ask the question the other way around. Are you against freedom? Are you in favor of theft? Well, the question is, why is a politician after bear who asserts this freedom so that they can have the goods as they wish? In fact, if you had two goods, identical, whose only difference was the price, and one is more expensive and one is cheaper, which one would you buy? The cheaper one. So you would choose that. So the question is, why would a politician ask the faculty to assert their freedom so that they could buy a product of higher price, and so that they could not do it, raise a wall in such a way that he could be robbed? Is it clear that this is immoral? Is it clear that they are condemning people to high prices? Are they condemning people to having no salaries? Are they condemning people to having less production, less current consumption, less future, and also they set their freedom, and you harmed almost 48 million people to say 3 pigs. Having said this, it is clear that it is deeply immoral, but also because it goes against freedom, because it goes against property rights. It is also inefficient, because if you could spend 100 on something that you are charging 400, you save 300 and reassign the resources to another sector that is more productive, and therefore will be able to pay higher salaries. There will be more products at low prices, with high salaries. It increases well-being. So the average is not only efficient, but also, we said it was fair, it is efficient, and also there are 48 million people in Nulis. I said the pigs. Now the question is, what is this? Those who defend these atrocities are going to be applauded and punted by the monopolists, that is, by the businessmen who put a ton of money in the journalists. And then you find that he do something in favor, let's say, it is in favor of the Argentinians, and you find that you are shaking the journalists and that behind the other businessmen pre-sale everything against the Argentinians of good and also the politicians, because if a pre-sale businessman says, oh, no, well, but I raved, and that restriction was Ming did then, but he knows then that it is unfair. Is he now that it is unfair? If someone comes and wants to remove it, God, don't throw a torpedo in your head, you almost wash it, and say, okay, ready, 80 years of child and the stream passed, and let's say, I made a project with all the Argentinians, but okay, someone came and wanted to change things, but the question is, if there is a barrier that can be managed by the government that allows them to sell something sometimes more expensive, the question is, teasing that and then other governments, there are angels that said, oh, look at this, what they would have said, come here, between 100 and 400, there is a huge difference. Do you remember that someone said that he could break a company? That company didn't break. The competition conditions didn't change. That was said for the flat steel, for the tubes. They puked them by television, but then those tubes were bought, and the ton of tubes, instead of paying $1,400, was paid $4,000. And that is what all Argentinians pay, because those were the tubes where the gas was transported. Then, the question is, are they in favor of corruption? Well, it seems that there are politicians, entrepreneurs, and journalists who are in favor of high prices, of no salaries, of lower jobs, of worse quality, and above all, the poorest, most negligent, but above all that, of corruption. That is why they have in favor of politicians, entrepreneurs, and those who fill the envelopes, speaking in favor of the criminals. In the end, the method is more or less the same. At that time, they jousted their lives. Well, now they do, a media carnage, because they have to defend the interests of the criminals of the system, because between firefighters, they are not going to step on each other. So let's say, if Adam Smith is still in power, and then another part that I find super interesting, with which I'm not attacking entrepreneurs, I am attacking pigs. What happens is that they are so perverse that they say, no, attack entrepreneurs. No, I don't attack entrepreneurs. I don't attack honest people. I attack dishonest people. I think it's a fight that is worth it. And then the other discussion that there is about Adam Smith is called the controversy of Adam Smith, that puts in dispute the contribution of Adam Smith in the theory of more feelings and the contribution of Adam Smith in the wealth of other nations. because he says that the spirit that is raised, which is sympathy, what today we would call empathy, in the theory of moral feelings, is in dispute with the idea of self-interest, and that raises an incoherence. In reality, there is no such a coherence. The problem is that the leftists, let's say, making fun of what they always do, which is the phallus, the scarecrow. That is, they say, the leftists. They do it very recurrently. They say, he said such a thing, and they hit you from what he supposedly said based on what they say he said. And one usually falls into the trap of groping and wanting to answer that what he said he didn't say. Let's say they are all the tricks with which they usually play to see the leftists in the debate. And one of the things they did with the concept of Adam Smith is to confuse the concept and empathy, or in the terminology of Smith at that time, sympathy with the idea of benevolence. One thing is that I put on misuse of the other and understand rationally the pain of the other person and accompany you because I understand, let's say, that a situation is painful to the idea of benevolence understood as putting someone's hand in the pocket. In fact, one of the virtues that Adam Smith mentions is benevolence and clarifies that benevolence is when you do it with yourself, not with others. And the other, let's say, lie they saying, is that it is an egoistic society. And they mix individualism with egoism, and that is false. Individualism means that you recognize that each one of you are unique and unrepeatable. Even with thy twins, they would be different. Therefore, let's say they make a confusion. So, to associate individualism with egoism, that is, that egoism is a situation in which, with such as to achieve your objective, you are willing to all, and that is not valid because Adam Smith himself, David of John Locke, and here's respected life, freedom and private property when he talks about jurisprudence, which is the moral version of justice. It is not worth everything. That is, there are things that you can do and you do not, because it is wrong. Suppose the following. You are a corridor of 100 meters. What is the problem you have? A man called, he's a boat. You have a problem. That man is an extraordinary thing. Because on top of it, even the luxury is given that he takes so much from the rest that he turns around and looks at them. That is, I forgive the term, but he beats them and on top of it he smashes them. Sorry, but I say, the guy is an outsider. He is extraordinary. And the guy that comes out second, like Psychonazo. Well, you, in the face of that situation, what are you going to try to do? And you are going to try to run every day better. Can you win? The selfish solution is to win at any price. You can cheat them in the head, and then they win. Well, that solution is not allowed. Another solution is, you can cut a branch. That solution is not allowed. That is, there is a concept of negative law. There are things that you cannot do, and that means respecting life, liberty, and property. If you want to win, you have to run better than him, not kill him. not be like the socialists who want to throw him in the stern pocket. Therefore, not only does that controversy in Adam Smith, but when you go and read the last parts as about the theory of moral feelings, it is very clear. Adam Smith talks about virtue, the virtues of the Stoics. Adam Smith was a Stoic. That is not less, because it means that you have solutions. That is, wait, let's see. I'm going to give you an example. We entered in the election year, that is last year, tightening the tax policy, tightening the monetary policy, and we release people. Look at what the populists did. They made public spending explode. They financed them with monetary emission, which is a scam, and is the type of change escaped. They corrected it by tightening the tax policy with more CICO. I mean, that is wrong, because it goes against freedom, because it goes against property rights, and we are not willing to do those things. Can economic policy do it? Yes, but we are Stoics. We are not willing to do it by violating life, freedom and property rights. Because if the policy that you apply is unfair, sooner or later it ends badly. That's why Argentina was sinking. That's why we make this proposal of the moral as a state policy. The moral as a state policy implies that the important are moral values, ethics, morals. That's above all. Designing a policy, and that has to do with Greek philosophy, with Roman law, with the rectitude of the Stoics. Let's say that part. Let's say Adam Smith. They put it in terms of self-control. If he could do a lot of things, probably the one who loses all the races with his aim bolt has the capacity to grab a revolver and blow up him with a shot, but he doesn't do it because he knows he has to win on the field. There are people who have problems with winning on the field, so I bring arbitral favors. Not only that, but apart from that, and then there's a question of values. We don't validate moral relativism. It's not worth anything. I mean, yes, in a time of history, slavery existed, but we are not in favor of that. We are against slavery. Let's say killing people is bad for us, even if for the socialists, in favor of their supposed common good, of the idea they have. If they have to kill people, it doesn't matter. It seems to them that it is a necessary cost because they put the collective above the individual, and if the individual doesn't close it, they liquidate it. No. And that's why the Christian Jewish values play a fundamental role. Freedom is respected because the first commandment, as it is presented in the Torah, is worship your Creator, the one who took you out of Egypt. That is the first commandment. The original version consecrates freedom, but it also consecrates. You will not kill. Consecrate. Let's say you will not steal. You will not covet other people's goods. Let's say capital sins condemn envy, anger. Let's say it. It's not that everything is worth. No. There are things that are not worth. There are things with which he don't screw. He don't screw with life. He don't screw with freedom. He don't screw with property rights. If you, then, let's say, work according to the values of the West. The question of efficiency naturally arises by the mere fact of respecting the principle of property rights, let's say the principle of appropriation of lot, along with the principle of non-aggression, and that makes the vast majority prosper and benefit. Therefore, when you work in a fair way, there is no tension between the ethical and moral values, the efficiency, and the political utilitarianism. However, when there is tension, it means that is unfair, and that policy doesn't deserve to be carried out, even when they give you votes. Let's say, he can say those are words. No, they are not words, they are facts, because we are doing it in real life, and we know that if we keep the result straight, even if it costs the cuts, it will be that we are going to make Argentina great again. Thank you very much.